as we move ahead to the next session, um, when travel and tourism grows, you know, the word, I'm trying to not use the word sustainable, but I will have to maybe. When we talk about sustainable tourism or sustainable travel, carbon footprint is something we all have been made aware of by the climate change, global warming, and the impacts of that, and what all of us have felt in our lives. And that is something that must be addressed as a special session, as a special conversation. Decarbonization of air transport, that is the next session that we have for you. And the speaker is Haldane Dodd, Executive Director, Air Transport Action Group. He's the person who's going to tell us what the industry is doing on the carbon footprint front and the initiatives that airlines and the industry is looking into. Thank you so much. The stage is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues, and a special thank you to Liz and the PATA team for the excellent organization of this event, bringing us all together again. And also the Ras Al Khaimah Tourism Authority, what an amazing reception you all had last night. I wish I could have been there, but working across time zones meant I had meetings that meant I couldn't be there. But of course, it's experiences like that and what we're able to see, feel, smell, and touch that remind us why tourism and travel are so important. Technology got us through COVID, very ably, of course, but the real experience simply can't be matched through a screen and a broadband connection. Now, I spend a lot of time at aviation and government conferences, and so it's nice to be at a tourism event, which is so much more colorful and full of life. The language is also a little bit different. You speak a lot more about destinations and source markets than I typically hear at the United Nations. But of course, there needs to be something linking destinations, and that is where we come in. Aviation carries about 58% of all tourists worldwide. In a normal year, and that's one that does not include a horrible global pandemic, we support nearly 90 million jobs, including 45 million jobs in the tourism that air transport makes possible. Just based on the panel that we had before, almost half of aviation jobs are women. But of course not in technical roles, and we have around about 6% of pilots worldwide that are women, so a lot more work needs to be done there, although that is something that is changing quite fast. Now, COVID took a horrendous toll on all parts of the travel and tourism business, of course, and air travel was no different. At its height, 64% of the global fleet was grounded. There was a 94% reduction in traffic in April 2020 compared to the same month a year earlier, and $1.7 trillion reduction in economic activity supported by aviation. The results hit across our supply chain and into the destinations that we serve too. But there were bright sparks to be seen. Like other parts of the economy, air transport asked how it could help. In 2020, nearly 40,000 special repatriation flights took place, ensuring 5.4 million people could make their way home when stranded overseas, whether they were on holiday, working, or seeking education. There were also 46,600 special cargo flights carrying 1.5 million tons of vital medical equipment, vaccines and masks, ventilators, and COVID testing kits. When it got tough, aviation rallied around and worked together to solve big issues. And cooperation is something that's built into our handling of short-term crises like COVID. But our job at the Air Transport Action Group is to focus our industry on the longer-term crisis, the one that will impact all of us across all sectors and which is an immense challenge to the world, and that's, of course, of climate change. I mentioned cooperation before, and it's something that is built into our DNA within aviation. If you think about the number of people and organizations it takes to get just one flight off the ground, flight crews, engineers, ground handlers, catering, technology providers, fleet planners, finance people, insurance, air traffic controllers, that's a lot of cooperation just by itself. Now multiply that by 100,000 flights a day, covering almost 50,000 routes and carrying 12.5 million people every day. That's a lot of coordination, and we are pretty good at it in aviation. So we took that philosophy of working together to also face other challenges. Safety was one, We're the safest form of transport on Earth because we work as one team. And the climate crisis is no different. How can the whole air transport industry work together to reduce our part of the broader climate challenge? First of all, you need to set a goal. And last year, we became the world's first industry to set a sector-wide goal of net zero CO2 by 2050. And a few weeks ago, we managed to convince the world's governments that they should also adopt the same goal under the guidance of the United Nations Specialized Aviation Agency, ICAO. That is now achieved, and we have a clear Paris Agreement-aligned objective that's a massive challenge, but it's achievable. So once you have a goal, you need to know how you're going to be able to make it a reality. And as Peter spoke of earlier, turning lofty goals into actions. Now, aviation is one of the so-called hard-to-abate sectors when it comes to climate action. Unlike electricity generation or road transport that have off-the-shelf decarbonisation options, we're going to have a harder time reaching net zero. But we've undertaken significant work to show it is possible to fly net zero, and we have a proud track record of doing the impossible. The flights you all took to get to Ras Al Khaimah produced on average less than half the CO2 that those same flights would have back in 1990. And our efficiency improvement has continued unabated for decades. However, the challenge comes from the growth in air transport. Growth is important, particularly in emerging economies where most of the increase in traffic out to 2050 will be seen. We need to serve new customers who want to connect to the world, but we need to be able to enable that growth whilst not increasing CO2 emissions. So how can we do that? First, in aviation, we look to new technology. Each new generation of aircraft produces CO2 emissions or reduces CO2 emissions by around 20% compared to the one that it replaces. We're also exploring new options, including flying on electricity for smaller commuter and island hopping operations, and potentially hydrogen for short-range operations. We could see electric aircraft operating before the end of this decade, in fact, and research is very much underway for hydrogen to be a possibility from around 2035 or 2040. But over 75% of our sector's CO2 comes from medium and long-haul operations. For that, we're going to have to replace the type of liquid fuel we use, and we've already been running flights on sustainable aviation fuels. There's that word sustainable, but this is important in the circumstance. They can help reduce emissions by 80% compared to fossil fuel. They're more expensive than fossil fuel, and we will need to scale up their production significantly to meet that net zero pathway. But they are a real-world solution, and they're available now. So there are a number of questions that arise when we say we're going to replace our fuel supply. First of all, can it be done sustainably without impacting food or water production? The answer is yes. Most of the feedstocks that we're looking at are either waste sources, non-food crops that can actually help regenerate soils between food crop cycles, or even sustainable aviation fuel made from low-carbon electricity. Yeah, you heard that right. Jet fuel made from electricity. We've already flown a commercial flight on it, and more work is underway. And you can see outside, there's an awful lot of sun available here in Ras Al Khaimah. We can turn that into jet fuel. The question is, and the major question is, how much will it cost to transition? And that's the tricky part. So we know it works. We've flown over 450,000 flights on a blend of SAF, and we know that scale-up is possible. We think we're going to need about $1.5 trillion in capital expenditure over the next 30 years to build SAF production facilities. Now that's about $48 billion a year, which coincidentally was the profit made by the oil giant Aramco in the last 3 months alone. So actually it's not out of the realm of possibility for energy companies to invest that kind of money in production capacity. We also know that it's going to have a cost on aircraft operations and those airlines that will need to fly on it. We think that the additional cost above traditional jet fuel would be about $5.3 trillion over that same period. Now, when you spread that across the world and across 30 years with a growing number of passengers, actually we think the costs are manageable. In some regions with already low airfares, costs may go up. Airfares may go up a little bit. But in many parts of the world, efficiency measures may keep airfares steady, and in any case, the cost of going green does not impact the growth in connectivity. So how do we make it happen? And here's where we may need some help from everyone here. Governments will need to put in place the right policy environment and help kickstart the energy transition for aviation. Having the UN-backed net zero aviation goal sends an important signal to governments and the financial community to invest. But pressure needs to be maintained on governments to turn that global goal into regional and national ones as well. And we are ready to make that happen. The more voices we have, including all of yours, the better. Now, I know that as travel and tourism talks about how it can meet climate commitments, aviation is always the so-called elephant in the room. We are a significant sector and a contributor to climate change. But we also have a plan in place, and we're getting the action underway to make that a reality. At the end of the day, if we stopped all air transport tomorrow, as some argue we should, we would reduce CO2 emissions by just 2%. But imagine the cost of that. The reduction in cultural exchange and family connections, the lost jobs across our industry and the wider economy, the deficit in understanding between peoples. The good news is we don't have to have that future. It is a challenge and one that I'm very excited to tackle. We can fly net zero and connect the world net zero too. So help us make that a reality. Thank you.